Thank you for the kind introduction. So I want to first provide a little bit of motivation for my talk. So all of this is kind of situated in visualization and visual analytics. And I think about visualization in terms of the role that it plays in data-driven decision making and visual analytics. So when you want to analyze data and make decisions, Daniel Kime and colleagues say that there are roughly these components. So starting with data, the part data scientists and statisticians and AI experts tend to be the most comfortable with is applying models to analyze that data to gain some knowledge or inform a decision. And then a large part of that analysis within the visualization community is, of course, then mediated by visual representations of data. And so those visual representations of data can look something like this. So these are all systems that were built by me or my students over the past several years that combine analytics and computations with the power of human perception. And the goal is to ultimately create these interactive visual representations of data to facilitate data-driven decision making. So statistics and machine learning models are integral tools in that process, but they aren't enough. And I argue that humans are an inseparable part of the process in a variety of domains, from choosing healthcare providers or treatment plans to deciding what consumer products or food brands that you want to trust or which car to buy based on reliability ratings, understanding policies that might affect different regions or populations in different ways, or understanding and preventing potential security risks and so on. And the point is that when situations are critical, we ultimately still want to rely on people to make those decisions. So people are a part of visual analytics, they're a part of data science, and they're a part of data-driven decision making, but this process is not a perfect one. So for instance, one issue is that data may be biased, or perhaps I should say data is biased. Um, One common example that we see of that comes from image search results. So this is an analysis that's been done many times, and it's gotten better over the years, but this is an example from 2018 from Pew Research Center. And they base this on Google image search results. So they analyzed many different aspects of search results that are returned when you search for a specific profession in different countries. And so in orange is the average position in those search results when you see the picture of a man, and in purple is the average position in those search results where you see a woman. And so at the top, you see pictures of men appear much higher in search results on average than women when you search for things like CEO or professor. And at the bottom, you see that women appear much higher in search results when you search for things like customer service representative or housekeeper. So when you try to make data-driven decisions with data that may be biased, you now get that propagated through algorithms in harmful ways. Virginia Eubank's book, Automating Inequality, does a great job of outlining some pretty heinous examples of this. So one example she talks through in her book is about homeless shelter intake forms that produce some rank order of how resources are distributed based on an individual's need. And so it asks information about name and employment status, but also things like mental health and sexual history, which all go into some complex black box system that produces this priority ranking of an individual's level of need and what resources they're going to be allocated. So it begs the question how this might be biased in the case of attributes like mental health and sexual history. Excuse me. And of course, in addition to those potentially biased data and models, the people who are making decisions with that information are also biased in various ways. So this can include cognitive biases such as confirmation bias, anchoring effect, Dunning-Kruger effect. It can include perceptual biases such as the illusion of causality, perception of outliers, perceptual interference like the Stroop effect. And it can also include gender biases, racial bias, and ableist bias that are all sort of categorized as implicit biases, and many, many more. And all of these biases shape the way that we see the world and the way that we interact with it, including the way that we're making decisions with data and visualizations. So again, we have potential issues with data, with models, and with humans. And when all of these things are combined, biases can be amplified and can lead to really inequitable outcomes. And in the context of bias, I've looked at things like anchoring effect, Dunning-Kruger effect, and confirmation bias. So I'll talk through some of those examples shortly. But I think about improving decisions by mitigating these biases through the lens of awareness, behavior, and decisions as three unique ways to measure progress towards that bias mitigation. Now, you may be asking, what do these animals on the screen, the lions and the tigers and the bears that I have little icons for here, have anything to do with humans in the loop? And I want to assure you that in spite of those crazy animals I have on the screen, that what I'm going to be talking about today is very deeply human. These human-centric measures relating to awareness, behavior, and decisions can provide robust and diverse lenses through which we can view the way that people are making decisions with data and with AI. So I want to give you a little bit of backstory about how I reached this lens. The year was 2021, where I was publishing the last piece of my PhD dissertation that sort of kickstarted this research agenda for me. And so we introduced this technique in a paper, and the technique was called interaction traces, which I'll describe in just a minute. We conducted a series of controlled experiments. And through those controlled experiments, we demonstrated that interaction traces could increase awareness of bias by coding these statements and utterances that people made during the experiment. And this work ultimately inspired the forthcoming work on metacognitive awareness and behavior change I'm going to talk about next. And it gave us a glimpse of how visualization had potential for real world impact, which I'll explore a little bit in the final project that I'll talk about today. So, as I mentioned, our design involved this concept of interaction traces, which show a user's own previous interactions with the data in the visualization to increase their awareness of potential biases that might influence their future analyses. So, how did we show that? This is a data set of fictitious politicians, and we showed some real-time interaction traces in the interface in a couple of ways. So we showed them in situ in the scatter plot by changing the color of the points based on how many times the user had interacted with them. So the colors change from white to blue as the users interact more with a given point. We also showed ex situ interaction traces by adding this additional view to the interface in the top right-hand side. And we use gray to represent the distribution of the underlying data and blue to represent the distribution of the user's interactions. And this view compares that underlying data distribution to the user's interactions and updates in real time. So for political party, we see that this data set has more Republicans on the right than Democrats on the left. But the user's interactions in blue show that they're skewed heavily towards Democrats. So that's the idea of the technique. Using this interface, we gave participants in our studies a political decision-making scenario. We asked them to choose a committee of 10 politicians to review public opinion on the bill that was banning abortion in Georgia after 6 weeks. At the time, it was recent, right? Not so much anymore, but we expected to observe things like bias towards a particular gender, bias towards the user's own political party affiliation, bias towards a particular age group, and so on. And we conducted experiments to measure how these interaction traces impacted awareness of unconscious biases, user behavior, and decisions, which corresponds to our lions and tigers and bears. So for awareness, we recorded utterances made by participants and then coded them as statements that either suggested awareness or did not suggest awareness. So participants said things like, "I'm surprised I didn't choose a doctor in my committee." "Wow, I thought I was choosing a more balanced committee." Or, "I thought I did a better job of Democrat versus Republican, but at least I balanced female versus male like I wanted." And we did some quantitative analysis on that coded data that suggested that these interaction traces did increase awareness of bias in certain settings. So we observed more of these awareness and surprise type statements when people were shown interaction traces versus when they were not. For behavior, we examined interactive behavioral results between conditions by looking at a number of different metrics, looking at the total number of interactions that participants performed, as well as breaking that down by interaction type, and even looking at some bias metrics that further characterize those interactions. I won't go into those results, but there were some observable differences there. And with regard to decisions, we looked at the actual committee composition that people chose. We found that bias in decisions was explicit but nuanced. So, for instance, one participant tried to balance their choice across gender. So, they tried to choose a committee of 5 men and 5 women, and political party. So, they tried to choose 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. But they ultimately chose a committee where all 10 members were opposed to the bill banning abortion. So, they explicitly prioritized committee members whose belief in the matter aligned with their own. So, it was kind of this interesting, nuanced, and very explicit type of bias. So there's a lot more cool findings in this paper, but I basically just want to say here that I used this as a starting point for expanding upon each of those directions of awareness, behavior, and decisions. So if we go back to our 3 measures, starting with awareness, um, these first two about awareness and behavior are a bit more theoretical, but I will tie it back to something a little bit more practical and tangible at the end with decisions. So for awareness, I use this lens of metacognition or thinking about thinking. And this was part of my NSF Career Award titled Promoting Metacognition and Visual Analytics. Um, and the idea is that when people have heightened metacognitive awareness or ability to think about and reflect on their own thought processes, it has a number of different benefits. It helps learners to assess the task that they're performing. It helps people to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses and plan their approach. It helps them to apply strategies to the task and to reflect. And specifically, there's some really interesting research results that have shown that heightened metacognitive awareness can lead to better performance in mathematics in university. It can reduce political polarization when people have heightened metacognitive awareness. And even people with higher metacognitive awareness may outperform those who have higher aptitude than them, right? So someone may be more naturally inclined to a particular task, but someone with heightened metacognitive awareness can actually outperform them. And the reason is if you think about the context of like an exam, studying for an exam in university. Someone who has high aptitude may do well on the exam, but someone who has high metacognitive awareness recognizes what their deficits are, where their weaknesses are, and they can mitigate that and strengthen those weaknesses by studying harder. So they may not be as, have as high an aptitude, but they can still outperform those with higher aptitude. So if we think about visualization as this process of learning about our data, then metacognitive frameworks can be a useful way for thinking about visualization. So, using this as inspiration, we had a Chi paper last year where we started with this framework of metacognition and visualization. We surveyed some work at the intersection of visualization and metacognition. And the spoiler here is that there wasn't much. There's not a whole lot that sits at that intersection. And finally, we tried to introduce a research agenda of where we think we can go by looking at this lens of metacognition. So, in learning sciences, metacognition is known to enhance learning by developing awareness of and practice in new strategies. And like I mentioned earlier, it can be a factor that leads to higher performance in exams compared to people who have higher aptitude. So, if we think about visualization as this learning process, this process of learning about our data, then metacognition can be this valuable layer that helps us understand our analysis strategies better and potentially perform more sound analyses as a result. So, metacognition can be broken down into 3 constituent components. So, the first is metacognitive experiences. These are the feelings and judgments that you have while engaging in cognitive activities. So, these are those conscious reflections that arise during learning, like feeling confused or feeling confident or realizing that you understand something better now than you did before, or judging how difficult a task is. Metacognitive knowledge is the second component. This is what you know about your own thinking. So this includes declarative, procedural, and conditional knowledge. And finally, is metacognitive skills or regulation. So these are the strategies that you use to control your thinking and learning processes. So this includes planning, so deciding how you want to approach a task. It includes monitoring or checking your understanding, for example, while you're reading something. And it includes evaluation, so reviewing your performance after you complete a task. And so in visual data analysis, metacognition might materialize as having this metacognitive experience of feeling frustrated, realizing why you're stuck through metacognitive knowledge, and then tracing variables step by step as a strategy to mitigate it with a specific as a metacognitive skill. So, how does all of this theory and concepts and constructs around metacognition fit into visualization? So, to model this, we considered the Van Wyck operational model of visualization, which starts with data, and that data gets transformed into visualizations, which a user then perceives. And that perception leads to new knowledge, which in turn alters the exploration and analysis strategies and can be used to specify new visualizations accordingly. So, if you're familiar with visualization research at all, you've probably seen this model before. It's a quite popular one from more than 20 years ago now. So now I've added in these metacognitive components into this model in blue, and I'll step through them really briefly. So starting with this perception block. This perception block now reflects that our perceptual experiences can lead to new metacognitive experiences. So that is these subjective feelings, those aha or I'm lost moments that we have while we're learning. And we added this dm over dt to reflect changes in metacognitive experiences that happen over time. Next is the knowledge component, which we now naturally augment with metacognitive knowledge. Metacognitive knowledge here is the understanding of how learning works, like learning that knowing that summarizing something is going to help you remember it better, or that you struggle with timelines and you need to visualize them. And the dm over dt again here reflects continual adjustments over time. Finally, through these exploration analyses we perform, we may develop new metacognitive skills. So in this case, it reflects the actions that you take to regulate your thinking. And in addition to those three components of metacognition, our model also reflects a few metacognitive strategies that may be helpful to consider integrating into visualization, such as self-explanation, self-questioning, self-assessment, which again are adapted from this learning sciences context. So what does all of this look like in a visualization system? So I mentioned that 2021 study earlier where we measured awareness, behavior, and decisions, and we did that with this tool that implemented interaction traces. And this tool was called Lumos. So Lumos shows a data panel where you can change the data set that you're looking at in the top left. It shows an attribute panel. So you can see all of the attributes of your data set down below. It has an encoding panel, so you can change the chart type and the X and the Y axis mappings that you want to see. It includes some filters down below that. It has the main visualization panel that in this case is showing a scatter plot of a movie's data set, and then it shows details down below that. And Lumos is designed to enhance that bias awareness by promoting active self-monitoring and self-reflection on the user's interaction traces. So focusing on the visualization part, the points in the scatter plot again get colored more frequently so that the more frequent interactions appear more as darker blue colors. And this can support self-reflection and awareness about how and why you have adopted these interaction patterns or strategies. And the same concept gets applied to these attributes on the left-hand side as well. As you interact more with specific attributes by applying filters or changing the encodings to represent those different attributes, they get colored to support reflection and awareness. So those darker blue ones are the attributes that you've interacted with more. So that covers the first contribution and research question about how metacognitive concepts get integrated into visualization. And next, we wanted to identify gaps and opportunities based on this model. So we conducted a review of the literature. I'll spare you the details here, but we searched across several venues. We looked at some keywords and reviewed articles and ultimately reached 21 papers that were at the intersection of visualization and metacognition. So there wasn't much there. And what we found was that only 2 papers explicitly mentioned metacognition. The remaining ones that we found relevant indirectly addressed metacognitive concepts. So, for example, some used a think aloud protocol where participants verbalize their thoughts in real time that could reveal some of these metacognitive processes. So, if you're thinking about your thinking, right, this metacognitive process of reflection, then think aloud protocols can potentially reveal that. Some papers also mention concepts like confidence or strategy that hinted at some metacognitive elements through secondary measures. And studies seldom completed that feedback loop. So, whereas that Lumos system showed interaction traces back to the user, that was the anomaly rather than the rule. So, very few systems actually showed this information back to the user. So, how do we use this framework of metacognition, this sort of theoretical concept going forward? Um, so, we provided some guidelines for visualization designers who want to integrate metacognitive concepts in visualization to promote reflection and awareness. So, there are things like visual difficulties or intentionally making things a little bit harder to parse, which has shown some benefits from a learning perspective. This was a concept that was introduced in a paper from Jessica Holman back in 2011. Um, and we also discussed 4 opportunities for visualization researchers. So this included things like promoting metacognitive awareness to mitigate biases or creating novel measures of metacognition as users are interacting with visualizations. There's a lot of interesting directions that we can go once we have this framework of metacognition to think through. So, to summarize, we started by establishing a framework of metacognition and visualization. We surveyed work at the intersection of visualization and metacognition, and we introduced that research agenda. And the goal of all of that is to promote that critical awareness. So, now for the behavior case. This is for situations when awareness in and of itself might be insufficient to change the outcomes. So let me preempt some questions here. Um, First and foremost, if my model is fair or my decisions are fair, then why do I care what behaviors led to it? Right. And I think that kind of boils down to this question of whether process matters. Excuse me. And a famous quote says that doing is learning. All right. So perhaps there is some value in the process and behaviors that lead into that process, insofar as it helps the user to learn, which certainly aligns with my perspective based on this work from learning sciences on metacognition. There's another famous quote. When we're talking about things like model fairness, it's really a question of whether the ends justify the means, which we can certainly debate, right? But instead of derailing the rest of my own talk here, let's just assume together for a moment that the process does in fact matter. So having some auditable process matters, and we can certainly revisit this premise later on if we don't agree. But the framework that I want to use to think about this are these behavior change frameworks that come from cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology. So one famous model on the left comes from B.J. Fogg, who introduced these set of axes that represent behavior change as a function of a person's abilities on the x-axis and their motivations on the y-axis. And the idea is that you're more likely to perform some target behavior if you have high ability and high motivation to do so. It also involves this concept of triggers, which is this external factor that influences when someone initiates a behavior. Next, on the right-hand side, there's a model called COM-B by Susan Michie, which is basically the observation that a target behavior is some function of an individual's capability, that's the C in COM-B, capability to perform that behavior, their opportunity, and their motivation to do so. So capability, opportunity, motivation is COM, and then the B is behavior. So these theories have been studied a lot in digital health contexts. So For example, researchers want to understand how to influence people's behaviors related to weight loss or managing chronic illnesses through digital interventions. And these frameworks have the potential to take us from metacognitive awareness to associated behavior changes. And in this case, the behavior changes are responsible analysis practices that we want to aim towards. So we are often really hyper focused on creating models that have high accuracy, but it can come at the expense of ethical rigor. So bias can creep into our decisions in potentially harmful ways. And even when we do focus on the fairness of our models, we relegate it to computational approaches often. So this effectively absolves data scientists and model developers of responsibility. So our target behavior change interventions will involve responsible data analysis practices that elevate the importance of ethical rigor through the lens of the analyst behaviors. So this is work that was presented last year at CSCW. We reviewed literature on behavior change from cognitive and clinical psychology, and we introduced this translational framework on behavior change interventions. So understanding how this could be applied in the context of responsible data science. So for this framework, we synthesized 3 types of relevant theories. I'll describe them and then show how we can apply them for responsible data science. So the first is factors affecting behavior change. These factors tell us about the individual or group level characteristics that can influence the likelihood of a target behavior being achieved. So this is the COM-B model, or the model that I showed from BJ Fogg that has the 2 axes. Behavior change techniques are the techniques or interventions that can increase the likelihood of a target behavior. And then mechanisms of action explain the underlying cognitive mechanism that makes a specific technique work to influence behavior. So let's consider an example from clinical psychology and digital health. Let's say we want to help individuals stop smoking and adopt healthier habits. Okay, so we're going to consider this context of smoking cessation. The factor that's affecting behavior change might be a trigger. So stress cues that undesirable behavior of smoking. The behavior change technique might be something like restructuring the environment to remove those stressors. And the mechanism of action might be considering the environmental context. So it may work by restructuring that environmental context. So that's sort of a classic example. Now let's consider data science example. Let's say we want to help organizations dealing with data, help their data scientists to build accurate and generalizable and unbiased models. So the factor that's affecting behavior change might be a lack of motivation to be concerned with model bias. We might consider educational interventions as our behavior change technique. And that may work by increasing the data scientist's knowledge about these specific challenges. Let's look at one more example in the context of visual data analysis. So let's say we want to help data analysts create unbiased and non-misleading visualizations. So the factor that's affecting behavior change here might be, again, a trigger. So people might need reminders about the ways that visualizations can be misconstrued. The behavior change technique we might consider is feedback and monitoring from automated systems or peers. So if we can provide users feedback about the visualizations that they're creating, that could be an effective intervention. And that works by this underlying mechanism of feedback processes. So to give you an example intervention in the context of data science, suppose you start a new Jupyter notebook and you're going to do this sort of classic analysis of loan applicants. So when you open the notebook, Jupyter automatically might insert this cell at the top that provides this 5-minute read on female loan applicants getting recurring rejections and the consequences for them. This can influence the motivation of analysts to engage in responsible analysis practices. So this is one specific intervention. Maybe it next also inserts a cell that takes advantage of this concept of goal priming. So by having analysts type out some explicit fairness-related goals prior to their session, they're going to be more likely to engage in responsible behaviors as a result. So finally, the analyst will continue their analysis process in this Jupyter notebook, analyzing and visualizing their data, now resolved to engage in responsible analysis practices. So to operationalize these behavior change theories, we want to first start by identifying the problematic and target behaviors. So what are the issues that prevent responsible analysis practices, and what behaviors should be replacing those problematic behaviors? Next, we want to identify the factors that are affecting those problematic behaviors. Is it an issue of motivation? Is it an issue of opportunity or capability? So what are the underlying factors that influence those behaviors? Next, we want to understand and employ the appropriate mechanisms of action. So how do those underlying factors influence the problematic behaviors? And then finally, use that to envision potential interventions using those behavior change techniques. So which interventions might be effective given those constraints? And this framing about behavior change for responsible data science introduces a number of challenges. I'll highlight just a few. One question is, to what extent can we facilitate lasting behavior change? So can we treat these interventions like training wheels that encourage responsible practices that become habit, and the training wheels eventually get to come off? Next, we can also think of interventions providing incentives versus enforcing consequences. So it's the carrot versus the stick analogy. So understanding what's going to be the most effective can be a challenge here. And finally, when we have increasing automation of these systems all around us, how do we ensure that we don't lose behavioral responsibility in the shuffle? So I showed how we reviewed literature on behavior change from cognitive and clinical psychology, and how we introduced this translational framework on behavior change interventions for responsible data science. And if you found that work interesting, we also have a Chi paper that's going to be presented next month, where we evaluated some specific behavior change interventions. So we have some empirical evidence about how effective these interventions are. And this is with my former PhD student, Ziwei Dong, and Leilani Battle at University of Washington, and University of Maryland's own Kiki Wu as well. So this work on awareness and behaviors ultimately can provide these different lenses through which to ensure fair outcomes. Of course, a good process does not guarantee a fair outcome. And I think there's some work to be done here about the extent to which these things may be correlated, though. So this finally brings us to decisions. So if you dozed off with the theoretical parts for awareness and behavior, now's the time to wake back up, because I'm going to show how we practically apply this framework in the context of university admissions. So how do awareness and behavior influence decisions? This is the question that we next ask. Now, I've touched on the connection to decisions a little bit in the past portions of the talk, but here I'm going to talk about how it was materialized in a real world deployment study. So this was the first project that I started working on when I joined at Emory, because I was tired of running these studies with arbitrary data sets to prove some hypothetical phenomenon without having any real impact. So if these techniques for influencing behavior and decisions and awareness are so promising, then why not use them? And so this has been some ongoing work over the past 5 years. So we started with some controlled studies that demonstrated implicit associations correlate to biased behaviors and decisions. And with this evidence, we sought to mitigate these biases in a system that we use for college admissions. And we deployed that tool in our own PhD program admission several years ago. So to give you a little bit more background and motivation around this problem, enhancing equity and diversity in higher education has been a really crucial topic for decades, but it remains this persistent challenge now even more than ever, right? Because of the current political climate in the US, and the overturning of affirmative action a few years ago. So in this project, we focus on addressing implicit bias such as gender and racial bias. So implicit biases are shaped by cultural norms or past experiences. They represent these automatic associations that we have in the brain, and people are often not aware of them. So, in the admissions context, reviewers' implicit bias can lead to unfair decisions. So, for example, there was a controlled laboratory experiment that showed that science faculty exhibit a bias against female students. So, they were reviewing application materials of a student that had a randomly assigned female or male name. And they had the exact same application materials, and the only thing that changed was the name. So if the application materials had a man's name attached to it, it was rated as significantly more competent and hireable than the identical female candidates. So education-based bias mitigation interventions, such as training courses, are often employed to address these biases, but they often lack this long-term effectiveness and have limited impact during the decision-making process. So therefore, in this work, we aim to fill this gap by developing these real-time mitigation strategies to increase reviewer awareness of implicit bias during the decision-making process. So we aim to answer two research questions here about how we can characterize and how we can mitigate bias in application review processes using interactions and visualization. And I'll revisit those questions a little bit later on. So we developed a visualization system called Rutabaga to support a bias-aware review process. And it was designed in collaboration with two admissions committee chairs. So the system supports review and rating of applications. It shows a profile view in the top right. So this is your typical tabular information about a candidate, including their GRE scores, their in this case for graduate admissions, or for undergraduate admissions like SAT scores, GPA, the schools that they went to, and so on and so forth. You can read documents that are in these tabs along the top here. So this includes the personal statement, the letters of recommendation, the transcripts, and so on. And you can write comments and give ratings according to some predefined rubric in the bottom right. So in our case, we defined academic, research, teaching, and communication as the dimensions that we were invested in. And importantly, the interactions in this interface are tracked. And they're used to derive these metrics of time spent across different documents, as well as the total time spent on each applicant. And we provide interactive visualizations designed to support individual reflection on that review process in this interface as well. So users may notice trends in the time that they spend across each document. So this bar chart is showing how much time they spent across each document. If their decision appears to be relying more on personal statement or more on letters of recommendation, you can sort of identify those trends. You can also see trends in how they spent time across applicants of different race and gender demographics. So for example, did I systematically spend more time evaluating candidates with specific characteristics? And you can also identify trends in how they rated applicants by race and gender. So not just how much time you spent, but ultimately the decisions that you make across those applicants. You can see trends there as well. And it allows users to check for internal consistency in their rating. So did I rate an applicant as competitive across all dimensions, but not competitive overall? So we took this interface and we conducted a controlled study. So we recruited 75 participants from the Prolific platform. And the participants first rated 12 college applications that were artificially generated to vary in gender and race and application quality. So in this stage, participants only have access to the rating features. They didn't see any visualizations at this stage. Once they finished all of their ratings, then they were provided access to the visualizations and guided to interact with them. And then they finished the study with a survey. And in that survey, they took implicit association tests for gender and race to measure implicit biases. So if you're not familiar, implicit association test, or IAT, is a tool for measuring the strength of a person's automatic associations between concepts. So you get a score that ranges from -2 to +2, where 0 represents no bias. A positive score indicates that there is a bias against women in the case of the gender IAT, or a bias against Black individuals based on the race IAT. So this is the more common direction of bias that we observe in US culture today. And a score of less than 0 indicates a bias against men or against white individuals. And the farther the score is from 0, the stronger that bias is. So for this study, we hypothesized that participants' review behaviors and decisions would correlate with those implicit biases. And we found support for that. So here, each dot is representing a participant, and the x-axis is representing the race IAT score. So as we introduced before, a positive score is bias against Black individuals. The higher the score, the stronger that bias is. And the y-axis shows the normalized difference in average review time spent among white and Black applicants. So a positive difference greater than 0 at the top means that they were spending more time reviewing white applicants than Black applicants. And we can see that there is a positive correlation here. Participants with higher race IAT score spent less time on Black applicants than white applicants, which our analysis revealed was statistically significant. And we had a similar trend in terms of race IAT and the rating differences. So we saw this for both time spent and rating differences, but I'll skip that for the sake of time. We also hypothesized that the visualization would affect behaviors. So to test this, we first looked at participants' interactions with the visualization. Hover interactions indicated that they explored the details of that applicant. Click interactions mean that they went back to review the applicant's application details again. And we saw changes in ratings as well, meaning that they updated the rating, the competitiveness rating after revisiting it. So overall, there was high engagement. And so we saw that the system did lead to some behavior and decision changes. This effect was also supported by qualitative feedback, where participants expressed how the system helped them to be aware of the disparities in ratings and time spent among white and Black applicants. So this participant said, "I was also surprised and perhaps disappointed with myself for giving white people higher scores and more time than Black people. I was not conscious that I was doing this, and it's good to know." It also led them to adjust their behaviors and their ratings. So this allowed me to adjust my behavior appropriately to give an even better and more accurate assessment. So we also conducted a case study to evaluate the rutabaga system in a real world deployment. So we used this in our 2021 to 2022 PhD admission cycle. And in fact, every year since then, we've also used it, but these results are from several years ago. We had 11 out of 12 admissions committee members use the system for reviewing applicants for about 2 months. And we were able to interview 9 of them afterwards. So we did similar analysis on the interactions, but I'll skip that for the sake of time. I just want to highlight some of the feedback that we got from the interview. So participants mentioned things like that the system helped in checking internal consistency of their ratings. So I checked the different distributions just to make sure that I was sort of consistent in giving my overall ranking. And they identified unconscious behaviors, such as not really spending time on a certain component of the application. So in this case, they noticed that for some of them, I hadn't really spent time on their writing sample. And this awareness led to behavior and decision changes. So this person said, "I went back and I had the chance to read over it. So it was a good chance to revise what I had scored for research preparedness." So in summary, we started with the controlled studies that demonstrated implicit associations correlate to biased behaviors and decisions. And with this evidence, we sought to mitigate those biases in the college admissions context. And we deployed that tool in our own PhD admissions program a few years ago. And if you found that work interesting, I also want to point out one more paper that we had last year on visual salience for mitigating gender bias in recommendation letters. And I'll also mention that we're continuing to develop and test this intervention, this rutabaga tool, more broadly beyond our program at Emory. So if you're involved in admissions at UMD and you're interested in trying this out, just shoot me an email and we'll talk. Okay. So I talked about awareness, behavior, and decisions. Here's the oh my part. The oh my part means I don't have answers, but I'm hoping that maybe you all do. So this is the what's next part. So I want to use the remaining time to make a case for why you all should care about and integrate some of these types of measures in your work. So, first is redefining success metrics. So, we can use these novel measures about behavior and about awareness to characterize robust and diverse human centric outcomes. So, do people have awareness of their strategies? Do they learn when they're using a model and do they behave differently? Likewise, we can use these measures to create personalized models. So, models that can infer or adapt to a user's metacognitive state. So, in other words, can models do or show something differently when a user is expressing uncertainty or cognitive overload, for example? We can also envision adaptive learning systems. So, envision AI tutors that can robustly recognize and respond to metacognitive struggles. Maybe we can create metacognitive literacy models, right? And we can also consider AI bias and ethics. So, not just from the perspective of model fairness, but from an integral perspective of how people use models. So, can we recognize not just when a decision is a bad one, but when reasoning is flawed and counteract it with appropriate countermeasures? And finally, we can use these perspectives to create better explanations. So, can we go beyond feature importance and use these cognitive, metacognitive, and behavioral cues to show explanations to people that mirror the way that they think about and process data? That's all I have for today. I just want to give a quick shout out to my PhD students, current and former, and my former postdoc Kiki, who's now a professor here at HCIL, who are working on such exciting projects that I get to fortunately be a part of. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Emily. I don't know if you can hear, but we have applause in the room as well. I have a microphone that makes it easy for you to hear questions in the room. I'm also have monitoring the chat. Feel free to raise your hand if you're online as well and want to ask questions. We have a good amount of time for questions.
Hi, Dr. Emily. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, first of all, that was a really great presentation. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. My
Thank
question
you.
is probably more of a UI design question than a data visualization question, but I sort of feel like that if we are placing interaction traces in data points, then the most frequently visited data points might have more affordance than the other data points and might bias the user to click those more. So is that something you have considered and how we can tackle against that? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's something I've thought about but haven't done any experiments on. I think it could have the reverse effect. And so you may want to try like the opposite encoding, where the unattended data points are are colored differently or sized differently to draw attention to those that haven't been given any attention in the past. Um, but that could be a more effective encoding, but I don't really have any evidence for that. But um, I think it's interesting from the qualitative feedback that we get from users from these studies. They treat it like a game, where they want to evenly color all of the points, or they want to change all of them to sort of look the same, or change this red to green. There's some other encodings that we've tried out with metric values before, and so people have this sort of gamified mindset about it and trying to change the encodings to sort of match some specific model. And so there's definitely a lot more work to be done in that space, I think, to understand what's actually driving behavior in the desirable direction, versus just nudging people to try to change everything to blue.
Hello, I have another question. Um, so for the case study, did they know that they were being tracked? Um,
Yes.
Okay, because like the tracking observation of people in itself would influence the metacognitive process because they're aware that they're supposed to be doing the right thing and that would change their behavior. So it feels like that would compound the effect of your treatment from their baseline. Like if you're going to be a little rat person, you're going to do it when you know you're not being tracked. So it almost seems like your significance would probably be higher if they didn't know that they were supposed to be engaging in tracked pro-social behavior.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the awareness of that process in and of itself could certainly have impacted the behaviors that we observed. At the same time, we were really concerned that people would take issue with their interactions being tracked to begin with. Surprisingly, they weren't concerned with it. Nobody expressed. I guess I mentioned 11 out of 12 people use the system. It's possible the one person who didn't use the system may have taken issue with the tracking aspect, but I think um, more often than not, it was just sort of clinging to the old tools that people were familiar with. So they wanted to do everything sort of offline. They wanted to print out the applications and review things manually. Um, at least that's sort of been the observation over the last several years. But it would be interesting to have to examine those behaviors when people know versus when they don't know that they're being tracked. But in the controlled studies, they did not know that they were being tracked initially, and so that gives us some evidence that the effect is sort of there. Although in the case study, like you mentioned, I think it's a little hard to separate.
Okay, I have a chance to ask a question. Hi, Emily. I'm very curious about the space of affordances that you think might be useful for prompting the kinds of awareness and reflections. So you have these interaction traces, right? And you've got these kind of studied techniques for mapping it to color and salience and so on. But I've been sort of pondering immersive environments where you get to make up encodings of how things behave in your environment. I'm wondering if you've ever felt any need for that, or like if you have any thoughts about how the kinds of things that you hope to prompt and enable intersects with the possibility space of immersive environments.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential in exploring different modalities for how you communicate that bias to users. There was a paper several years ago. I say several, it might have been 2 or 3 years ago, at Chi. It was a late breaking work called Bias Buzz. And they took these similar metrics and gave haptic feedback through the mouse, which
Uh-huh.
was a really interesting kind of encoding to explore for these bias metrics. So I think there's a huge design space of things that you could consider for different ways to convey that. Um, and I would love to explore that more. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I've been limited to these sort of screen-based examples so far, but I think it's a huge, wide open space.
Yeah. I was blown away when I went to WIST, and like yeah, haptic was one place that my mind went to, right? Like you sort of you want to have a sinking feeling, right? When you're sort of going in a particular direction that you don't want to. And like there's a whole space of like, interfaces that could support those kinds of signals, right? Beyond the stuff that you're seeing on the screen. So seems like there's a lot of opportunity there.
Definitely.
Hi, I have a question.
Go for it.
So it's also about the last project that you talked about. Oh, first of all, thank you for a great presentation. And I just wanted to know that, so in the last project, it showed that with interventions and visualizations, it can improve awareness of people. But I'm wondering how might we measure the actual outcome of it? Because you also mentioned during presentation that fair practice doesn't necessarily lead to fair outcomes. So I'm just wondering, like, what might be the appropriate setting to measure that fair outcome? And how might we like measure the associations or the connection between conducting fair practice and fair outcomes?
Yeah, so there's a lot of DEI type of research that defines what some desirable outcomes might look like in the admission setting. A lot of that is very taboo now since affirmative action was overturned, that we're not allowed to think about or consider those things. So there's a huge effort in the education and DEI space and trying to redefine what desirable outcomes even look like. So it's a fantastic question because in different contexts, desirable outcomes may look very different. Um, Choosing, to admit a class of computer science PhD students that are 50% men and 50% women might be ideal in some cases. But if your application pool is, say, 25% women and 75% men, then is 50-50 really fair? Right. So deciding what those desirable outcomes looks like is not trivial. I don't have a good answer for that. I think it's totally context and situation dependent, and people who get paid a lot more money than me are the ones responsible for making those decisions, I think. But it all starts with deciding what that desirable outcome looks like, because that's how you're sort of nudging those behaviors, right? Are you encouraging people to interact with 50-50 men and women? Are you encouraging people to interact with something that's representative of the distribution of the application pool? Um, those have some pretty serious implications. And so, yeah, it's a great question and a tricky problem for sure. That I think just has many different answers depending on the context that you're looking at it in.
Thank you for your answer.
Thanks.
I have one more question if nobody else has one. I'm very curious, Emily, about um, the sort of moments of reflection, and when and where and how and with whom reflection can be useful for mitigating these biases, right? So I'm imagining, like, in the context of a high stakes, high pressure situation, you sort of don't have a ton of time in the moment when you're doing the sort of analytics tasks. But you could still be collecting some of these interaction traces. But I was wondering if you thought about, in the context of admissions, maybe the moment for reflection is not while I'm doing the things, but like when I'm just comparing my scores with somebody else, or like, so I was wondering if you thought about how that shapes the design of the reflection affordances and opportunities.
Yeah, so I think when you trigger that reflection certainly matters, and we've explored that in a couple of different contexts. If it's real time while you're analyzing the data, or whether it's after you've made some preliminary decision but before your decisions are finalized. Um, and I think what we've anecdotally found as the most effective is after, like, not real time, because it tends to um, lead to a little bit of cognitive overload. There's too many things to manage during that decision making process itself. And so prompting that reflection after preliminary decisions are made and before they're finalized, in the admissions context at least, seems to be what people prefer and when they actually interact the most and make the most changes. Um, so I think, yeah, that timing matters a lot, but yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into what makes for effective reflection. And there's a lot of the literature we rely on a lot there comes from personal informatics. There's a lot of work in personal informatics on reflection,
Yeah.
that we try to borrow from and learn from, and sort of adapt these ideas for how to prompt that reflection in this space of data analysis and decision making. Um, but yeah, it's not effective for everyone. This reflection is not enough to change behaviors for a lot of people, or change decisions for a lot of people. But for a lot of people, it is, right? And so knowing which types of interventions, whether it's awareness related interventions or behavior change interventions, are going to be effective for different populations is another sort of direction of future work. Um, I think the awareness related and reflection related interventions presuppose that someone wants to do well. They have some notion of good, and wanting to do good and wanting to debias themselves. And that's not always the case for a lot of people. A lot of people either don't care or have different notions of what good looks like. And so these sort of ideas that we try to impose on people may or may not be received well, depending on, each individual person. So I think there's a lot of personalization types of aspects to that reflection work that can be done as well.
Right.
Sorry, just following up on that question. So, in a college admission study, did you measure how the awareness converted into actions or into decisions or more fair decisions? And for example, like a conversion rate. And I was thinking maybe having like another level of intervention so that you can actually turn the awareness into actions, into actually like just more fair outcomes. Just wondering.
No, we didn't do that explicitly, but that's a great idea. Trying to do that sort of correlational analysis, or see what the actual conversion from an awareness statement to an associated behavior change or decision change actually looks like. We did like behavior to decision conversion analysis, but I think it's a little bit trickier with awareness because awareness isn't always externalized. I think some of that is sort of dependent on the individual and how much they're, how forthcoming they are in their think aloud process. But I think it's a fantastic idea. That would be a cool follow-up study.
Thanks.
Emily, thank you so much for joining us. We will applaud in the room, and thank you for your time and for joining us. And hope to see all of you after spring break. Have a good spring break next week. Thanks, Emily.
Great. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.